Some questions for you to start with. So which country has the highest mean spend per visitor in New Zealand? You might be able to slightly guess from some of what Stephen talked about earlier. Which country do you think it is? Australia? Japan, China, US? I haven't actually heard the answer yet. Germany. So it's Germany. And just under 6,000 per visitor is the mean spend. How many tertiary students in New Zealand last year specialised in tourism? What do you think? 27? 20,000? Any other guesses? 6,000? 5,000? 4,000? 6,000. 6,075. And then when you look at the chart, you can see how they're kind of split between the different levels of what people are studying, from like a certificate through to a diploma or a degree. All right. What is the average length of stay in New Zealand for all visitors from all countries? How long? What's the average? And I was really surprised by this. 5 days?
8 days.
8 days, 12, higher. 18 and a half. Totally blew my mind. I, for some reason, thought it'd be a lot lower. And when you look at it over time, you can see how it's been changing, which is interesting when you kind of match it with the spend and how that changes, but also the change in number of people that are coming from different countries. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Lillian Grace Aho. So I'm the founder and CEO of Figure NZ, and we exist because we believe that numbers and data, like I was just talking about, actually holds a lot of our stories, and it's something that everyone is capable of using to make good decisions for businesses, communities, etc., rather than it being something that is just for experts. Because there's so much happening with data, as you're probably all aware, and it can be quite overwhelming, and often it's kind of kept to the side for experts. And our whole mission, our kaupapa, is to say actually it's something that everyone can use and not just the experts, and so we're here to help make that happen. But before I talk a little bit in detail about Figure NZ and what we specifically do, I want to talk about the kind of the context for change and why data is on everyone's lips at the moment and why it's different. Like there might be conferences every year or so and there's new things coming out, but what's actually so different about now compared to 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 20 years ago? And then I'll give you a little bit of the history of data and some of the things that we've learned, because I find that it really helps when you come to use data yourselves to realise that everyone is facing the same difficulties and has often the same kinds of questions. Then I'll talk about Figure NZ in detail and what we do and how we can help in the workshop this afternoon in more detail, but also at any time that you want help, you can ask us. So I've been in the tech sector for just over a decade now, and it's been really interesting in that time. We're all aware of how many new tools come in front of us through the change in having digital technology. Through hardware and software, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of new tools that have been created over the past 10 years or so. And it's kind of every day, and it seems to be more rather than slowing down. It seems to be speeding up. And so when we look at that on a regular basis, it can be quite overwhelming, and it can just feel like an iteration of new things that we can use. But what I like to do is to step back and say, what has actually changed? What's the underlying kind of behaviour that's shifted, so that we can really understand from a more first principles basis how to think about it and how to navigate this world of so much information. And when I think about it, and about all of the things that have changed, I think there's one big underlying trend that almost all of the tools and the technology is in servitude of. And that is that until the widespread use of the internet, so 12 or so years ago, quite simply, it used to be really hard to share information, and now it's simple. Now it's easy. It used to be expensive and time-consuming and hard, and now it's cheap and easy and something that we can all do. And it sounds so simple because it is, but it's a massive, massive change. But when you think of all of the different business tools that you're being asked to use, all of the different data and everything, it's all kind of shares on this theme. And it changes everything. So when you think about the world when it was hard to share information, it made all the sense to be operating in hierarchical structures, whether it was the way that we governed countries or companies or community organisations or others. It made sense because when we could only send information to one place because it wasn't online, it had to go to one place and have people able to think about it and make decisions and essentially tell everyone else what to do. And we became really used to that because it made the most sense. But now that's different. Now we live in a world where it's easy and it's cheap and it's so expected that you can communicate in multiple directions with lots of people. And I think that we can't underestimate how much of a change that theme has on how we use the tools and the technology and set ourselves up to operate in it. And I think it changes not just how we can govern ourselves and how we can make decisions, but it also changes things like who is responsible for sharing information and who can demand it. You think about back 10 years ago, we couldn't demand that people open up their data or publish data for us to use because it wasn't something that was possible. And now that has shifted. Now we can have an expectation, or we put on a sense of responsibility that people that have information need to share it with us. But what's really important to remember, I think, and the reason that I like to look back at the theme when I think about it rather than just looking at what's possible now, is remembering or realising that we're all at the start line. We're only 10 years in to an enormous transition from where it was hard to share information to where it is easy. And none of us really have any idea in 20 years what that will look like. And so when you look at things like, how do we start using data, or how do we start using more online tools in our business, I think realising that everyone is struggling to figure out how to piece all those things together and how to prioritise which things to do when you need to keep your business going at the same time. And so Figure NZ, we work with lots of organisations. We work with some really big organisations in the public sector and the private sector, and everyone is struggling. No one that we come across is nailing how they use data and digital tools throughout their organisations. Everyone is finding it hard because we're all at the start. And it's also really important, I think, in the first kind of 10 years, we've been so focused on the tools that have been in front of us because they're so delightful and new and exciting. And I think it's now that it's kind of time to remember that the tools aren't the purpose and aren't the mission, and that it's more, given that there's so much information and so many different tools, it's really more important than ever, it feels like, for us to step back and say, so what is our mission and what is our vision and what is our purpose, what do we want to achieve, and then find the things that serve that the most, rather than just jumping on to new technology because it's there. And so when I kind of talk through the history of data and how that has gone through this transition and this theme of being able to share information easily. So if you think about what society was like when not everyone could read, and we used to believe that not everyone was capable of reading, and this kind of scene was normalised where just a small portion of the population were involved in reading and kind of sharing information in that way. But we don't accept that model now, right? We absolutely believe everyone can learn to read, and we might not all be able to read to the same level, but we can all participate in that part of society. Every year as a country we invest in teaching people how to read. We don't do a business case for it because we just fundamentally believe that it's an important, valuable skill for everyone to have. Yet we haven't made that transition with the use of data yet. When we tend to consume data, it's often in a scene like this, where, just like this morning, including my presentation now, where someone will stand up the front and show some data and kind of present already formed views on it. And so you have to almost be a little bit aggressive to disagree or to come up with your own kind of interpretation of what it could mean. And so we aren't yet at the point where we expect everyone to be able to use data in part of their thinking, yet I think it's really, really important. And so I like to think about why. Why is that? Why haven't we made the transition of using data and normalising it as a part of literacy in the same way that we did with reading? Dramatic pause for effect. So I became really interested in this and about 6 years ago, and started to look at the state of data, like where does our data come from and how do people currently use it and why isn't it something that everyone can use. And what I came to realise is that most of our data, so when I say data, the public aggregate data like I used in the examples at the start, most of our data is collected as a byproduct of a service. So you might jump on a plane, you might register at a tertiary organisation, you might go to the doctor or register your dog, and all of these activities almost accidentally turn into data sets. Nobody set out to collect the data as a way of answering questions. They were instead just there to capture the number of services that were being provided. And not only that, but most of these data sets were established before, often before the internet was widely used, and so they were established on either local computers or on paper, etc. And what that means now is you fast forward to when we can share that information easily, and we all suddenly realise that our data sets, even the ones that are at a country level, are often really, really hard to use, and there is no consistency in definitions. Often there's not the data that you want that's available. And the other thing is that most of our data is kind of organised by source. So you have to know who collected something before you can find it. And that makes a lot of sense when you're just publishing a data set on a website, if you're an organisation that has data for the country. But when it comes to being someone that wants to use it, it's as silly or as hard as if you had a dictionary that was ordered by the country of origin of the word, where you opened it up and the first thing you had to do was figure out where it came from. And so if you don't know that, say, NIWA exists, you can't find information on New Zealand's climate. And so quite simply, when someone goes to use data, often they end up looking like this, where it's just too hard to find and too hard to use once they've found it, because all the spreadsheets and all the different databases and everything are different. And this is the case for the country, for other countries, and also internally for organisations and businesses. And the reason that I like to kind of look at this part of it and also look at the historical context, even though you probably have data questions for right now, is because understanding why some things don't exist or why there's a bad state of data is important to know that that wasn't by design. It was just an outcome of not imagining today. And so to get to a state of having the data that you all need, there's going to need to be some kind of understanding of what people need, what questions you have, so that data can be collected like that. But because lots of our data sets, lots of our stories are held in our public data sets. And here's some examples. So the first one, so in the 1950s we had about 129,000 hectares of sand dunes. How many do you think we have now? Don't go shy. Any heard of 60,000? Any other guesses?
I think it'd be probably half of that now, given the development that's taken place.
Half that now, so they're about 65,000. 25,000. That really surprised me. And also, what I find interesting with data like this is that lots of us care, right? Like, it's an interesting thing to know, but it's held in a data set that you would, on a spreadsheet that you would have to go to a website and find before you can actually see these stories. So a lot of our stories are held in these public data sets, but also everyone can really benefit from using it, whether it's a person that's running a philanthropic organisation wanting to know where to invest, whether it's a business owner wanting to know what language translation services to target, whether it's a school student wanting to understand local water quality for a project. There's so many activities that we do that could benefit from understanding these stories. Yet, kind of despite how useful it can be, most people don't use data, and most of our data isn't used. So Figure NZ, I had the idea for Figure NZ about 6 years ago, and that was because I came at data really sideways. I actually trained as a high school PE teacher and then worked at another tech organisation and then worked at a think tank. And it was at the think tank that I opened up for the first time the Stats NZ website and the OECD database, and I was just floored. It's like, what's this? There's literally thousands of our stories sitting in these kind of online portals, and I didn't even know that they existed. And what I realised was that everyone that works in data thinks it's really normal and easy to find stuff, and everyone that doesn't work in data doesn't even know to look for it or what exists and what questions there are. And so seeing that and seeing how valuable it could be after learning how to use it to solve big problems, set up Figure NZ to solve that for our country. And so we exist to help everyone be able to use data so that they can understand the country for whatever reason in whatever context. And we are a charity, and the reason for that is similar to something like Wikipedia. When it's knowledge infrastructure for a country or a world, it doesn't work as well if it's in commercial or public sector kind of models. And so we work to serve everyone regardless of what sector or age or stage or location they're in. And what we actually do is there's kind of three main things, and we're happy to talk in more detail if anyone cares, but I'll just skim across it because I suspect it's not that interesting and specific to you. But we've built a platform to take all of the data sets, the thousands of data sets that sit around the country on different websites, and to process it and to turn it into simple machine readable format. We then publish it all on figure.nz. That's a URL, figure.nz, where it's free for anyone to take and use. And so we have about 40,000 charts, about 800 thematic maps, and a whole bunch of all of the raw data behind those charts is available as well. And then the third thing we do is we teach people how to use it and how to think using data. And that's been really hard. That's realising that people just knowing that Figure NZ exists doesn't mean that they're going to easily become data literate, because it's really hard to use data well. Because often when you look at a chart or something, you end up with way more questions than you had when you started. And so you have to really invest in the time to really go through and understand something. And I can take you through that more when you come to the workshops this afternoon. As an example, so we often run classes where we get people to go through 4 different points of how to think about a chart and how to understand it. And I know you won't be able to see the detail of this from where you're sitting, but this is a chart that I showed to a class of 6-year-olds. So I had 20 6-year-olds, and this chart has the number of dogs registered by type. So by the way, there are about 500,000 dogs in our country. And it shows that there are about 42,000 Labradors, there's more Labradors than any other dog, etc. But I said to them, I took them through this process, and I said, so who do you think would care about this data, and what would they do differently? And these 6-year-olds said, if you had a pet store, you would want to make sure that you had more dog food for big dogs, because there are more big dogs. And I was just like, yes! Just like, my work here is done. Like, to talk about data influence decision making, and so often, even though like in the workshop when we go through this really simple 4-step process, it's to actually help to rewire our brains to think differently and to think creatively about data, rather than to look at it and think, oh, there must be a perfect answer that we see that's kind of expected from us. And this is one of my favourite ones because it led to a cafe. This is the average price of a hot meat pie in New Zealand, and we tweeted it a couple of years ago, and someone came back to us and said, oh, our cafe rips us off because they charge $5 instead of like the $4.20 or $30. But then a couple of days later, they came back to us on Twitter and said, oh, I showed the chart to the people that run the cafe and they've dropped their prices to $4.50. I was like, yes. So there are lots of like little silly examples like that, but other good examples of people using data. But the most important thing to remember is that it's not really about the data. And we don't talk about, as an organisation, we don't talk about data-driven anymore, because when you know the history of data and how it's collected, you know it's so flawed and so biased that you definitely don't want it in your driver's seat. it's really valuable to add to your thinking and to use as a creative lens and as a part of the storytelling to understand things that you can't otherwise see. But that's more important to kind of step back and say, what don't we know that we wish we knew, and what would we do differently if we knew the answer? Because if you're not thinking through that framework, then looking at data and learning something's not going to have a change anyway. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in the workshop. So we are actually partners with Tourism NZ, and so we have a place that you can all go to find data that's specifically relevant for you, which we'll talk through and show you as well. And we're actually also partners with ATED, and so can specifically help with data on Auckland for you. Thank you so much.